Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. Our brains are pretty amazing machines. They seem to be quote-unquote pre-wired with a survival instinct, as well as the capacity to learn from experience and to think and feel. My guest today is neuroscientist Tony Zador from the Cold Spring Harbor Lab in New York. Tony asks fundamental questions about human intelligence, starting with biology, such as what's the relationship between the genome and the brain? And more broadly, how has evolution influenced our genome and hence how our brains are wired? These are fascinating questions at the frontier of neuroscience and artificial intelligence that I'm going to discuss with Tony today. Tony, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
So, Tony, I've been reading your work and it's just fascinating, and I've got so many questions about it. But I want to start with something general. Two general questions I want to sort of begin with, and those are, what's happening at the frontier of neuroscience these days? Like, what's the excitement? And then after that, we'll get into sort of what's the connection to artificial intelligence. But let's sort of start with the biology of things. Like, what are we learning about the brain?
Yeah, so the last 10 to 15 years have been an amazing time in neuroscience, largely driven by some major technological advances, along with some conceptual advances as well. So on the technological side, we've had a couple of really significant breakthroughs. The first is that we can now record the activity many, many more cells at a time than we can. So a neural circuit is comprised of millions or billions of individual neurons, depending on the particular organism that we're talking about. And somehow these millions and billions of neurons talk to each other and say things. And what we as neuroscientists often do is eavesdrop on them. And by eavesdropping on the neurons, we can infer what is going on, how the computations are being performed. And when I started in neuroscience, the technologies that were available only allowed us to eavesdrop on one neuron at a time, typically. And in the last 10 years, the numbers of neurons that we can record from at a time has gone up orders of magnitude. So now we can eavesdrop on thousands of neurons at a time. And that's important not just because we get 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 times more data. In fact, to some extent, that's a challenge by itself, but also the fact that we're recording all these neurons at the same time allows us to understand how, in a concerted fashion, they generate their messages and perform their computations. So that's been one really important breakthrough. And I'll just mention a couple others, and then we can return to the individual ones. A second one is that over the last 15 or so years, we've developed the ability to identify subtypes of neurons, subpopulations of neurons, which are sometimes, these subtypes are sometimes correlated with function. So we can now figure out the functional organization of the circuit, and we can actually manipulate those neurons on their activity on the time scale that's relevant to computation, on the millisecond time scale, through a technique called optogenetics. Anyway, those are some of the major breakthroughs that have occurred in the last 10 years.
That sounds fascinating. And I usually start this conversation by asking my guests to say a little bit more about themselves. And this is probably a good point to do that, because you said when I got started, and, I feel sort of the same way about AI. When I got started in AI, I thought it was relatively primitive, but I was drawn to it anyway. What's your journey been? What drew you to neuroscience? And I'm assuming that the state of the art there at that time was relatively primitive.
That's right. I had a meandering path to where I am, and I continue to meander. It's never been a straight line. So I started my undergraduate studies in physics because, like a lot of people, I like orderly descriptions. I like mathematical descriptions. But by the end of my undergraduate years, I realized that what I was really interested in describing was how we think. And I was pretty naive about how to approach those problems. And through introspection, I concluded that I think in language, so I ended up finishing a degree in linguistics. But by the end of that, I realized that really what's interesting to me is how thought arises from the 3 pounds of matter that are in our brain. And that's why I went into neuroscience. And in fact, I went into computational neuroscience because that was a field that was just opening up at the time. This was in the mid-'80s. And people were beginning to really double down on mathematical descriptions of neurobiological processes. And so I became a computational neuroscientist as a graduate student. I worked with, part of my PhD was with Christoph Koch, who is one of the leading computational neuroscientists today. But by the end of it, and during that time, that was the early days of computational neuroscience as well as of artificial neural networks. And in fact, those two fields hadn't yet really divided fully. So the meeting now known as NeurIPS, formerly known as NIPS, was actually the core meeting not only for people in artificial neural networks and machine learning, but also for computational neuroscientists, people who are trying to understand and model brain computation. So by the end of that time, I actually had to make a decision about whether I was going to continue on, because the fields by the end of my graduate work were kind of dividing. I had to make a decision. Am I going to be an experimental am I going to be a neuroscientist, or am I going to pursue artificial neural networks? Because my PhD was trying to understand what was it about biological circuits that differed from the simple formulations of artificial neural networks at the time.
So at that time, was the predominant paradigm in neuroscience that intelligence was something innate, or that it was learned, or were people just sort of completely agnostic about that? Because that's been sort of a raging debate for a long time, right? This whole nature versus nurture thing.
Yeah, that certainly has been a debate. In the field of artificial neural networks, I mean, the field is sort of alternatively named machine learning. So it's pretty clear what the view of that part of the field is. Learning is everything. I would say that in neuroscience, there were some famous debates, as I'm sure you know, over the centuries, really, between nature and nurture. I think in neuroscience, the answer has sort of boiled down to it's not either or. It's how nature and nurture interact to produce a final working organism, right? Because it's clear they work hand in glove. It's neither all one nor the other. And I think these days people at the front lines don't really argue about it. They do experiments to show, aha, here's another way in which they interact. Now, I've been trying on some of my, and maybe we can talk about that a little later. I've been trying to bring some of that sort of balance back into the field machine learning of artificial neural networks, and remind people that organisms going anywhere from insects all the way up to humans don't learn everything. In fact, they don't learn most of what we know. We come with a great deal of innate knowledge, but that's not to say that we don't learn some things and that learning isn't important. So it's really the combination actually of what's innate, what's expressed through interaction with the environment during development and what is actually learned. In fact, there are three processes.
I was struck by this article that you wrote in Science where you quoted two people who were at CMU roughly at the time I was there, which is Herb Simon, who made this very optimistic prediction that we'd have a chess champion in 20 years. I guess he said that in 1965. And then you quoted Hans Moravec, who was sort of building some very primitive robots there. And I forget the exact quote, but it's something like, that thought is a very recent thing. Maybe it's 100,000 years old, but what's primitive is evolution, and that over, hundreds of millions or billions of years of evolution, that somehow we've sort of developed this machinery that's innate to us that enables organisms to survive in the early stages, when it's critical, whether it's days, weeks, months, whatever it is, right? There is something sort of innate about this. And you've kind of fleshed out this thinking into a theory here. So let's get into that. Let's get into your thinking here, because you're making a connection between the genome and intelligence that I find fascinating, right? So let's try and sort of unpeel that, because you're right. People in AI assume that, let's just train a machine from scratch, because the whole innate stuff is just very difficult to do. It's very difficult to sort of encode prior knowledge by hand and then get a machine to learn. So let's just get the machine to learn. And we've achieved some pretty impressive kinds of levels of performance in perception. But I'm getting the sense that maybe we're hitting a wall now, that the next step of intelligence requires sort of coming to terms with this issue of, there being something innate about intelligence. So I'm sorry, I've said too much, but
no. I think that's exactly right. So it's funny. I didn't make the connection that the two people I quoted in this Nature Communications article were both at CMU. I confess I've met neither of them in person, but have read their work. I think
as was Jeff Hinton, by the way, at that time.
Well, Jeff Hinton, I did know he was there. I did know he was there. Yeah. Although I don't know how much he interacted with those guys. Maybe he did. When were you there?
Early 80s.
I see. Yeah. So Herb Simon famously said that in 1965 that a man will be capable within 20 years. Machines will be capable within 20 years of doing any work a man can do. So I'm not sure if playing chess counts as doing work, but there's a lot of work that men and women can do that machines still can't do, and I think that's part of the challenge. But my rallying cry is this quote from Hans Moravec, which maybe I'll read in its entirety because it's so beautiful, it's so well written. He wrote, encoded in the large, highly evolved sensory and motor portions of the human brain is 1 billion years of experience about the nature of the world and how to survive in it. The deliberate process we call reasoning is, I believe, the thinnest veneer of human thought, effective only because it is supported by this much older and much more powerful, though usually unconscious sensory motor knowledge. We are all prodigious Olympians in perceptual and motor areas so good we make the difficult look easy. Abstract thought, though, is a new trick, perhaps less than 100,000 years old. We have not yet fully mastered it. It is not all that intrinsically difficult. It just seems so when we do it. And I think that's exactly right. The things that we consider hard, right? What is the pinnacle of abstract thought? Well, one example is chess. Right? And that turns out not to be so challenging for computers. Whereas even the world champion chess playing computer still needs a surrogate to move the pieces. Certainly, there's no artificial system that can take the pieces, that can go over to the shelf and bring over the box of pieces and set up the board, which, even a 3-year-old can do. So that's really what this is about, right? Why is it that artificial systems can do some of these things that are wildly difficult or impossible for humans, whereas they can't do the simplest things that human children, or for that matter, animals can do. Right? That's the interface with the real world, and that's what evolution, what a 500 million years of evolution have endowed us with the ability to do. We all animals inherit the 500 plus million years of evolution that led to where we are today. And the stuff that makes us uniquely human, I mean, we can argue about the evolutionary evidence, but as Moravec says, it's the last couple 100,000 years. So it's really very new.
It is, and that's a beautiful quote. And you use that as you say, as a starting point for building your theory. So now your theory is that the genome actually doesn't encode that much information, right? So, as you point out, it's got 3 billion base pairs. That's our genome. And our brain is much too complex for all of that information to have been specified in the genome, right? So now let's get to this relationship between the genome and intelligence. So how does something that's simple, and I'm calling the genome simple, give rise to something as fascinating as intelligence?
So I think that's the starting point. The key observation is that the genome is quite small, right? So our genome is, as you say, about 3 billion base pairs. Each base pair encodes 2 bits. So that's relatively small compared to what? Well, compared to the complexity of a neural circuit. So, naively imagine, a human brain has, just to get some numbers on board, a human brain has about 100 billion neurons. And let's say all you want to do is specify naively which neuron is connected to which other neuron. That's potentially 100 billion squared zeros and ones, right? If you allowed any arbitrary circuit to be expressed. And that clearly cannot be expressed explicitly in a genome, right? 100 billion squared is a very big number, about 10 to the 22, which is about 11 orders of magnitude off of the size of the human genome. Now, that's an exaggeration in terms of we can do a little better bounding the complexity of the circuit underlying the human brain, because neurons don't connect to all of the neurons. They connect to about 1,000. But still, if you do it a little bit more carefully, you still end up with a mismatch of 6 orders of magnitude between the complexity of the human brain sort of wired up explicitly with the wiring explicitly encoded in the genome and the size of the human genome. So there's this mismatch. So what the usual answer to this, right? Machine learning answer to this is, well, of course, it's not encoded in the genome. The usual answer is that it's encoded over the course of evolution. Over the course of a lifetime through learning, right? The wiring diagram in a normal machine learning setting is absorbed somehow through experience. Now, we know it can't be through supervised learning because children don't learn primarily in a supervised fashion. We don't point to objects and name them over and over again, and there's also a lot more going on. So maybe it's unsupervised, but there are so many things that all organisms, even humans, can do with little or no experience that it has to be somehow present already at the time that at the time they're born.
And so your theory is that whatever is present at the time they're born is something really simple that evolution has found to be useful as a general purpose thing, right? So it's somehow it's passed this information, something very simple, a simple building block.
That's right, or a series of simple building blocks, and we can see those building blocks sort of emerge over the course of evolution, right? So what are the simplest things any animal needs to do? Well, we can sort of tell a simplified just so story about how evolution gave rise to animals. The sort of defining feature, if you like, of an animal compared to a plant is that an animal needs to wander around, typically to find food, right? That's plants produce their own energy through light, but animals have to go around and somehow find food. So they move. And maybe the very earliest animals were simple foragers that moved around, perhaps feeding on the decaying bodies of plants, right? And then maybe they started developing a sensory apparatus. So instead of wandering around randomly, perhaps they wandered in a more purposeful manner. Look, there's a little patch of possible food. And that's the beginnings of a sensory motor coupling, right? It's the beginning of a connection between taking sensory input about where you should go next and performing a motor action. And that's the beginning of it all, right? The loop between sensing the world and performing an action on the world, right? And, we can tell a just so story about how then there were other animals that emerged that fed off of this first set of animals. That would be predators. And now if there are predators, then another thing the sensory apparatus of a possible prey animal has to do is to detect the presence of a predator. And so now we have sort of the basics of animals. And that's the substrate, right? That's the substrate for all of this. And what you get then are successively more complex systems for controlling and making decisions, for controlling the bodies of these animals, where to go, how to interact with the world, and make decisions about what to do next on different timescales, right? And all that information, right, has to be encoded in the genome in such a way that each successive generation of organism can inherit as much of the sort of useful structure that has been built into the nervous system as possible from the previous generation.
This is sort of consistent with Darwinian evolution.
Absolutely. I'm just explaining how evolution plays out in the formation of circuits. Basically, every generation, you have a genome that produces a neural circuit. The neural circuit, let's be a little bit more careful here.
Yeah, actually, because you've used the word circuit a few times, right? So let's define what you mean by a circuit. So as a circuit, my understanding is you mean connections among neurons. So
that's right.
How many neurons one neuron connects to and how far they are from it.
That's
what you mean.
Yes, exactly. So, first of all, let's just be clear. The genome encodes not only the circuit, it encodes the building blocks of the circuits, which are cells, right? So a neuron, which is the basic unit of the nervous system, is a specialized cell that is particularly good at performing certain kinds of functions. Basically, neurons communicate typically electrochemically with other neurons, and they typically communicate to a specific subset of neurons within a particular organism. And so what I mean by a circuit, to first order, is the wiring diagram of which neurons are talking to which other neurons. Now, small simple organisms typically have or can have as few as can have hundreds of neurons, right? So one of the simplest organisms studied by neuroscientists is something called C. elegans, and it's a small worm, pretty ubiquitous, that has 302 neurons exactly. It turns out it's a highly stereotyped nervous system. 302 neurons and 7,000-ish synapses. So out of the 300 squared, which I think is 90,000 possible synapses, it has about 7,000 of them. And each individual, each genetically identical individual will have an almost identical wiring diagram. So that's one extreme, right? You don't get
so that's one extreme where it's innate. It sort of comes wired.
Exactly. It's an extreme in terms of stereotypy, innate, and also in terms of the size of the nervous system, right? And C. elegans is a very successful organism. It's very widespread, and it has some fairly complex behaviors. It's amazing, actually, how sophisticated the behavioral repertoire is, even with that small a number of neurons. It's like it's just packed in there, right? And then you get sort of somewhat more complex organisms like insects. So a widely studied insect is the fruit fly, Drosophila, and it has about, I think, I could be off here, but it's about 100,000 neurons, right? So what is that, about 2 orders of magnitude more neurons, give or take. And as if you've ever tried to catch a fly, right? Flies are capable of some pretty sophisticated behaviors on very fast timescales, right?
Yeah.
And we know that some of the structure of the Drosophila nervous system is stereotyped, and some of it is, we think, it's variable for individual to individual, and probably arises through developmental rules that are stochastic, that involve coin flips. So the form of the rules for wiring a Drosophila circuit often involve random choices. I'm going to make it up, but sort of conceptually, rules of the form, take a neuron from pool X and connect to about 30% of neurons from pool Y. That would be a possible sort of stochastic rule. And in some cases, those stochastic rules are also informed by experience from the outside world, right? And that's where sort of we start getting into this gray area. Is it nature or nurture? The answer is yes. In high school, kids used to ask each other, did you walk to school or carry your lunch? Right? It's not one or the other. It's not nature or nurture. It's some combination of the two. And that's how the wiring, that's often how sort of innate plays out and interacts with nurture in the formation of a neural circuit.
So going from fruit flies to humans, let's consider Mozart and his sister, who were musical prodigies at an early age. Is that innate? Do people like that have different wiring rules that are passed down through evolution or mutation that are somehow different from the rest of ours? Or is that kind of ability learned at an early age, or perhaps through gene expression or something else? How do you think about that?
Yeah, we don't know, right? We really don't know the full source of variability in human abilities, right? It's some complex feedback loop. Observation suggests that certain kids are more drawn to one subject than another, right? And then there's often this positive feedback loop. And how that plays out, I think we can't unpack it yet. We don't understand the incredibly complex interactions of genes, random coin flips. So here, let me sort of lay out all the possibilities, right? So certainly, the reason that humans are capable of cognitive feats that mice and dogs and even monkeys aren't is in our genome, right? We live with dogs, and yet dogs rarely pick up guitars and start composing songs, right? And they don't even react to music in the same way that humans typically do. So there's clearly huge dogs. No other creature on Earth is capable of complex language the way we are, and that leads most people to conclude that whatever is necessary for complex language is, if you like, innate to humans and not to any other organism currently on the planet. Right? There's debate about whether our close cousins Neanderthals had language. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But Neanderthals are gone, and so we're the only creatures on the planet capable of complex language. But the individual language, I mean, this is a great example of the interaction between nature and nurture, right? The specific language that you end up speaking is a function of the languages, if you like, that you're surrounded by when you're young, right? There's a critical period for learning language, and whatever language you're exposed to when you're young, right, is the language you'll end up speaking. So that's sort of how nature and nurture play out. So, why is it that some kids become prodigies in some areas? Is it that their circuits are particularly well tuned to some particular set of computations, and that in turn those computations are then reinforced? That would be my guess, right? It's some complex interaction.
Since we're talking about thought, and that's sort of what drew you into this area, how far are we from sort of making the connection between wiring diagrams and thinking? What does that connection look like?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we're still pretty far. So circling back to what we started with, talking about the breakthroughs in neurobiological technology. So what we would really like, one thing we'd really like as neuroscientists is to be able to understand how something gets computed at the level of a neural circuit, right? That's what we would really like to be able to, if you like, recapitulate a computation at the level of a neural circuit. And that remains pretty challenging. So what we can do, so let me tell you why, actually. So I'm perhaps being a little bit pessimistic, because I take for granted our successes, and I'm frustrated by the computations that currently remain challenging. So on the one hand, right, we know an awful lot about the computations that occur on the front end and on the back end. We don't know everything, but I think we basically have the story. And what do I mean by that? Well, how do visual scenes get into your brain? They get into your brain via the retina. And we know an awful lot about how the retina works, how your eyes work to transduce light and to do a lot of complex pre-processing to convert the visual signals into a form that are then processed further by downstream brain areas, right? So again, we don't know. There are still people doing really interesting work discovering new things about retinal circuitry, but I don't think there are fundamental mysteries. There are unknowns. There are many known unknowns about how the retina works, and perhaps there are even some unknown unknowns, but I don't think there are deep mysteries left about, and I'm sure I'm going to get my retinal colleagues complaining by this statement to me about this statement, but I don't think there are deep mysteries left about how the retina converts visual signals, light into neural signals. And I think the same is true at the cochlea, transducing sound, and in general at the periphery. And similarly, the last mile, if you like, of signals coming out of the brain, nerves driving muscles, we know a lot about how that works as well. It's the stuff in between, the interesting stuff, that the further toward the center of the brain you get, the more mysterious it becomes, the sort of vaguer and looser our explanations.
So is that stuff going on towards the center of the brain related to consciousness? I asked because I had Jan LeCun on the pod a year ago, and he conjectured that consciousness is more a reflection of the limitations of the human brain and not its power. His view was that there's a lot of prediction going on in the prefrontal cortex all the time without it consuming any attention. So as we talk, I can see your face, but I can also figure out what the back of your head looks like, but it isn't relevant, so it remains hidden. But to deal with something or to solve a problem, we need a decision maker stepping in and taking control and focusing, and we become quote unquote conscious of what we're focused on, which I thought was an interesting way to look at consciousness. So coming back to the Hans Moravec quote, is it the case that we've had the circuitry that enables thought, but that thought is something that is quite distinct from perception and this stuff that goes on inside us without us even realizing it, right? That stuff is on autopilot, whereas thought is something much more deliberate. I'm sorry, I've said too much again.
No. I think it's funny. These are the questions that, trying to understand thought and consciousness, are the questions that drew me into neuroscience. And yet I can't give you an answer to how they work. If anything, my decades in neuroscience have made me more humble about my ability to understand these things. So I think one problem is that the word consciousness means so many different things. And so, step one is to unpack this incredibly overloaded word, right? So, the very first thing it refers to is a state, right? If you've been hit over the head, you are quote unquote unconscious, right? And I think, we have some understanding about brain states and what is it about them. And, there's still a lot of interesting stuff to learn about how sleep works and the various states of sleep and of arousal and what is a coma. And some of these are medically really important, right? So, but I think that's not the thing that gets most people fundamentally interested in, what is consciousness. That people want to understand that experience they have of the world, of themselves, right? That's what I think many of us would like to understand, is what it feels like to be us. And that remains, on the border between neuroscience and philosophy. And it's very difficult to come up with, to even know what an explanation would look like that would be satisfying and that would account for the experience of being, for the experience of being you, right? I guess by about 150 years ago, there was a debate raging in biology about what is life. And there were two schools of thought, right? One is that life somehow arose from the basic principles of chemistry. And there was another school of thought that held that there was some special life essence that was sort of fundamentally different from regular chemistry. And that's no longer under debate by scientists. We now know what life is, right? We understand how, life arises biochemically through DNA and RNA and proteins. And we no longer have that debate. Any debate about the border between what is and isn't alive is a sterile debate. It's a semantic debate. Sometimes it's legally important, right? At what moment do you say that a person is dead, and that is legally and morally important? But it's not a scientific question, right? Because we understand all the gray in between life and death, all the gray areas between life and death. And I think what would constitute success in understanding consciousness would be something comparable, and we're nowhere near it, unfortunately. We know in the same way. So I'm not a dualist. I don't believe there are still a minority, but a non-zero fraction even of neuroscientists who are dualists, who believe that there is some consciousness essence that's comparable to the life essence that people posited 150 years ago for life. I don't believe that. I think that somehow.
What does that mean? So what do you mean by consciousness essence? How would it be encoded?
Yeah, exactly. I ask you to ask those people what they mean by that, right? Like I just don't see how it's basically dualism. There are different manifestations of dualism. The view that your fundamental life, soul is somehow separate from your physical brain and body. I don't consider that to be a defensible scientific position, not to sort of challenge anyone's religion, but it seems non-scientific to me. And there are some scientists who try to defend it, and I find it sort of too alien a position to even try to explain.
The notion of soul sounds it's very abstract and almost sort of takes us into Twilight Zone. But on the other hand, things like feelings and that stuff is just so real, and it just seems
feelings are absolutely real, right? Like it would be inane for a neuroscientist to deny the internal experience of feelings. But the challenge, which we haven't solved as neuroscientists really, is to explain why what it means to have a feeling. I mean, we could talk a little bit about sort of how they are similar in some ways to what animals experience. And who's written a lot about this and has, I think, really interesting thoughts on this is, I don't know if you've had Joe Ledoux on your show, but
I have not, but I have communicated with him. Interesting that you should bring him up.
Yeah. No, he's a colleague of yours at NYU, has done foundational work and has recently written several really interesting books on feelings and how they manifest in neural circuitry. So those are really important questions, and those are real questions, and those are things we would like to explain. And I think his understanding of it, he's on the track to understanding and having explanations of it. And it doesn't involve positing, something non-physical. I'm making a claim that I think is non-controversial for most neuroscientists, but perhaps somewhat potentially less obvious to non-neuroscientists, which is that everything that we feel and think and experience arises out of neurons and the activity of neurons talking to one another, right? And
yeah, indeed. In fact, when I was, reading your articles and just sort of more broadly clue myself up for this conversation, and I started reading about thinking, feeling, and all of the complexity that happens in the frontal lobe. There's also, I guess, we have a capability to suppress things, right? We have a capability to suppress certain feelings. So the brain also does that thing. I shouldn't say this because
there's so much going on. Going back to consciousness, right? I mean, away from sort of the deepest, most philosophical questions, there are some, empirical observations that I think shape the thinking of many neuroscientists. So there's a great deal that goes on unconsciously in our behavior, in our perception, and the conscious part is. To go back to more of like the thinnest veneer of human thought. So, I mean, there's some beautiful experiments where there's an optical illusion and I'm blanking on the name of the optical illusion, but where the perceived size of a disk depends on the context. So if you take a circle and you surround it by a bunch of other circles, if the other circles are very small, then the center circle seems large, and if the other circles are large, the center circle seems small. Okay?
Yeah.
And it's a pretty, you've probably seen this optical illusion.
I know there's a few others like it. In fact, as you're speaking, it reminds me of Steven Pinker's How the Mind Works. And it's funny how little you remember of things you read. I mean, I must have read that, 15 years ago. But the one thing I will never forget in reading that book is he said, if you turn your head sideways, the world stays straight. The world doesn't go sideways as well. And so the brain does things that are useful because it's not useful to you to have the world sideways. So it just sort of does that stuff for you, without thinking about it.
So anyway, it's actually called the Ebbinghaus illusion. But here's what's interesting about it. So it's a profound illusion. You can look it up, and you can measure the size of the internal circles, and they're exactly the same. But when you look at it, it's clear. Like you just have this overwhelming impression that one circle is bigger than the other. But here's the interesting part: if you now design an experiment where you ask somebody to pick up that circle. Right? When people pick things up, they adjust their hand position to the approximate size of the thing they're about to pick up. If you pick up a coffee cup, your fingers are the appropriate distance for a coffee cup compared with a pencil. Right? So now, if you ask the question, what is the hand position of somebody who's grasping or has been asked to pick up one of these circles whose sizes are actually the same, but which appear to be different because of their context. It turns out that the circuitry in your brain that adjusts the size of your grip is not fooled by that illusion. So, right, whatever is going on in your conscious mind that is screaming to you that, it's very easy. It's because conceptually, it's easy to understand what's going on, which is that your visual pathways take information from the outside world and then split it up into multiple representations. And the particular representation that is controlling the size of your hands is not the same one that you have access to when you have when you're making a conscious decision, when if I ask you which one is bigger, right, that is typically tapping into the one on the surface of your consciousness, right? Which is bigger is the one that, the one that you see, but that's not the one that's controlling your hand grip. And it's a really beautiful demonstration, this dissociation between, in this case, two representations, but there are multiple representations of everything all the time. And the vast majority of what you do is unconscious. So I can't explain consciousness, but I have a favorite just so story. It's not my theory, but it's one that I subscribe to for how consciousness arose over the course of evolution and what it's useful for. So, we're primates, and for at least the last 25 million years and maybe longer, we've lived in social groups. And they're complex social groups with complex social dynamics. And what we have had to do as primates, along with other monkeys, is come up with good models of the other members of our group, right? So I don't know, we have a couple other dozen monkeys in our band, and each one has a position in the hierarchy and has a characteristic personality and is either likely to cooperate with me or attack me or compete with me. And I need to have as good a model of the behavior of every member of my clan as possible, right? Like, am I going to get away with stealing your piece of fruit, or are you going to bite me, right? Are you going to steal my piece of fruit? Should I worry that you're coming close to me? Could we work together to get a new piece of fruit, etc.? So I need to have complex models, right? And as the behavioral repertoire became more sophisticated, the models became more complex. And at some point, these models, which were explaining the behavior of other individuals in the group, turned back upon themselves and began to explain my own behavior, right? So I have a part of my brain that's in charge of modeling your behavior and trying to understand, are you smiling at me, or is there a blank expression indicating that you're completely bored and would like to move on to the next question, right? But I'm also applying that same model to myself and predicting my own behavior. And this leads to a situation where you have most behavior happening autonomously, if you like, and then the conscious part of us is this part that is apparently predicting our own behavior, and it feels like we're causing our own behavior. And that's why we have this impression that the conscious part of us is deciding what to do. But in fact, there's a lot of evidence that in many cases, perhaps most cases, the conscious part of us isn't making decisions. It's not running the show. It's just predicting, doing a good job predicting what we're about to do. So we're really fooling ourselves.
Fascinating. I was thinking that maybe natural selection just weeds out the people who always go for the other person's fruit, or are incapable of suppressing their feelings, or, if their wiring diagrams are such that they just sort of, can't function in a community.
I think natural selection selects for the people who can get away with stealing other people's fruit without being caught, right?
That's right. Yeah, but
I think that's what game theory tells us.
Yeah, I don't know how much I buy that. I guess if you get away with it all the time, sure. But there's a Bob Marley line, right? That you can fool some people sometime, but you can't fool all the people all the time. So maybe
is that Bob Marley?
That's Bob Marley. So maybe natural selection just gets rid of that, right? You're not just going to fool everyone all the time.
That's right. And those groups full of people who are trying to fool people all the time at the group level, they don't do very well. So there's, the evolutionary dynamics here are pretty complicated.
Right. A couple of other things I wanted to touch on, and that's like humanity has seen a couple of major discontinuities, recent. One is the introduction of the computer, and the other is sort of going from subsistence to abundance. I mean, those seem to be like two major, or at least basic kind of abundance, right? I'm not talking about like everyone's got a Ferrari, but I'm talking about like everyone's got enough. Like you're not like foraging and wondering about.
I would rephrase that. We have figured out how to produce enough for everyone. We haven't figured out a societal structure.
Sure.
We haven't figured out a societal structure that, going back to the question of game theory, that allows everyone to get enough. But that's a social engineering challenge.
Right. So what are the implications of that for the genome, or vice versa?
Well, I would say that you left off a revolution. So there's the revolution in computers. So people say that the 20th century was the century of physics, right? And in some sense, the advances in computers are one of the most important consequences of the advances in physics, right? The transistor and all integrated circuits, and so we're now living in the information age, the computer age. But what we are entering is an even more profound, or potentially equally profound, revolution, which is that we now have the ability to manipulate our own genomes explicitly. And the technology for that is getting better and better, right? So either maybe 2 years ago, there was a Nobel Prize for CRISPR.
Yeah, fascinating technology.
Yeah, so it's just the latest in a series of technologies for manipulating genomes. And it's going to have enormous implications for medicine, but eventually also for the human race, right? So the first CRISPR manipulated children were born about 2 years ago in China, through the actions of a rogue scientist. It was illegal and widely condemned, because we still don't know what we're doing. And there are attempts to put a permanent ban on manipulation of human genomes. But the genie's out of the bottle, and it's going to be very tricky to keep people from manipulating genomes in a generation or two. And so what are the implications of that? We don't know, right? It has the potential to be truly profound, that we can actually accelerate our own or change the course of our own evolution in this way. You've probably seen the movie Gattaca, and that's about as good a guess as any as to what that world is gonna look like. It could be, it could be a far more radical perturbation even than that. So, yeah, when it comes to the future of the human race, the question is even, what is it going to even be the same human race?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, right? Is this the end of evolution and the beginning of design, where we just kind of design ourselves in ways that we like?
Yeah, the one of the challenges there is that we have the ability to make the changes, but biology remains incredibly complicated. So understanding all the consequences of a change to the genome, it's hard to imagine we'll really understand that.
But at the same time, the tools are really widely accessible, right?
The tools are incredibly, yeah. The
like
tools
a college
are straightforward.
freshman could do this, right?
Maybe a senior at this point, but the guy who did it in China, he did not have he was a scientist with his own lab, but it was a pretty straightforward manipulation. So the problem is that, the making the changes is straightforward. Understanding the significance of those changes for the resulting human, we're not even close. Right? We do not understand. Going back to the very first question, somehow genes encode circuits, and circuits encode, give rise to behavior, but we don't know in detail what the path is, how genes specify a circuit, and we also don't understand how different circuits specify different or give rise to different behaviors. So two huge unknowns there. But that's not going to stop. I think that's not going to stop people from making these manipulations. So, brave new world.
Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, no, indeed. It's sort of fascinating to think what the brave new world will look like. I'm just amazed that all of this stuff is happening within my lifetime. I never would have thunk it.
Yeah, me neither.
So, Tony, just in closing, what would be your advice to young people these days? High school students, college freshmen, what sort of general advice do you give kids?
I have my own kids, but do you mean life advice, or what academic areas they should pursue? What's hot?
Both. Just, like life advice and what academic areas they should pursue, like how they should train themselves to think about this emerging.
So my parents were born in Hungary in the 1930s, and they lived through difficult times, wars, barely survived wars and revolutions. I was born, in the 60s, in a very quiet time, and living in the West, in the United States, but this would have also been true if I'd lived in Western Europe. We lived in a time where we could largely ignore history, and I could just, live my life. But I got to say, I've been advising my kids that they can't ignore the world around them politically, even if they want to. I think, we're entering a time of global turmoil, and I've sort of told them to keep their eyes open. I'm not in any privileged position to be giving that advice as a scientist, but that's the just as an observer of world events that I've been passing on to my kids. Don't count on the world being stable throughout their lives the way it was through my life. You can't put your blinkers on. That was a mistake that my grandparents made in not leaving Hungary in time. But scientifically, we're at a spectacular time. I mean, neuroscience. I would like to believe that this next few decades we will finally sort of understand the brain in the way that we understand much of the rest of biology. We still don't. We understand all the pieces, but there's still this fundamental mystery of how those pieces are assembled in a way to produce thought and consciousness. And those are incredibly challenging questions, but I think ultimately they are amenable to scientific inquiry. And, I would like to believe that I will still live to see the sort of fundamental solution to those mysteries. And even if I don't live to see that, I strongly believe my kids will. And I've also been, I subscribe to a view, I think, as articulated by Richard Feynman, who said something along the lines of, that which I cannot build, I do not understand. And, that's why I've always had one foot in AI and one foot in neuroscience, because I feel like if we actually understood how neural circuits give rise to complex behavior, we'd be able to recapitulate, to build machines that do the same thing. It's even possible that we'll be able to build machines that do that without fully understanding it. So it could be that we will be able to engineer intelligent machines without fully understanding what intelligence is.
Thanks for that, Tony. Really, really well said. I couldn't agree more. I think that understanding the brain is probably the essential next step to, taking intelligence forward. I'm just fascinated by this whole notion of thought and consciousness and its connection to the wiring of the brain that you've studied so deeply. But thanks for being on, and also great advice about, the world going forward will just be incredibly much more volatile and fast changing. I just feel that we've sort of reached a point in our evolution where, between computing and biology, the power we have at our disposal going forward is just fascinating to do all kinds of...
What I think there's a famous Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I think
that's right. Yeah. It's attributed to them anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we are beginning to live in interesting times.
We are indeed. Thanks so much, Tony. It's been a pleasure having you, and thanks for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much.